My name is Eleanor, and for 24 years, I have been a walking shadow within my own family's luxurious home. That night, our house in the lush suburbs was filled with the scent of expensive lily and the clinking of crystal glasses. My parents were celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. Everyone in attendance was dressed in their finest attire, laughing softly while holding champagne flutes, praising how perfect our family seemed. I stood near the buffet table, wearing a simple black dress I had bought with my own overtime pay. My unwritten duty that night was to ensure the guests never ran out of drinks. My father, Richard, stood in the center of the room in a suit worth thousands of dollars, while my mother, Margaret, looked radiant draped in silk. Beside them stood my younger sister, Ivy. She was the center of my parents' universe. A dramatic silence fell as my father tapped a silver spoon against his glass to request everyone's attention. He began to speak about how blessed they were to have such a harmonious family. He praised my mother's beauty, and then his gaze shifted to Ivy with a spark in his eyes that I had never seen when he looked at me. My father announced that they wanted to give something special to mark this moment. My mother then pulled out a small maroon box with a gold logo I recognized instantly. It was a jewelry box from Cartier. When Ivy opened it, a gold watch encrusted with diamonds sparkled under the crystal chandelier. It was the Panther de Cartier series. I knew it cost approximately $15,000 because Ivy had begged for it during our summer vacation last year. The room erupted in applause. Ivy shrieked with joy and hugged both Mom and Dad. The three of them looked like a perfect family portrait under the spotlights. Meanwhile, I stood 5 steps behind them, holding an empty tray, feeling like a piece of furniture accidentally left in the room. Not one of them turned toward me or even offered a small smile. Throughout my life, I had always been the responsible child. I earned a scholarship for college so they wouldn't have to pay a single cent. I worked part-time to buy my personal necessities. I never came home late, never got into trouble, and was always there whenever they needed help organizing their social events. But in this house, responsibility was a punishment. Because I could take care of myself, they felt no need to provide affection or attention. In contrast, Ivy, spoiled and frequently troublesome, was always showered with luxury as a reward for her mere existence. After the gift-giving session, my mother called over a professional photographer they had hired. "Come on, time for a family photo," she exclaimed cheerfully. I set down my tray and stepped forward, trying to smooth my hair, which was slightly messy from helping in the kitchen. I prepared to stand beside my father. However, just as I was about to enter the frame, my father raised his hand politely but firmly. He whispered in a voice low enough so other guests wouldn't hear, yet sharp enough to slice through my heart. "Eleanor, please step aside for a moment. This one is just for the immediate family. Could you go help get more ice from the kitchen?" Those words hit me harder than a physical slap. Immediate family. I was their firstborn, their own flesh and blood, yet on their most important night, I was regarded as a stranger, ruining the aesthetic of their photo. I watched Ivy posing with her $15,000 watch, leaning on my father's shoulder while my mother held her hand. They didn't mind that I wasn't there. In fact, they seemed more relieved without my presence. I retreated slowly without saying a word. I walked toward the quiet kitchen, leaving behind the laughter that grew louder in the living room. There, amidst piles of dirty plates and leftover food, I stood staring at the wall. No tears fell. The pain was already too deep. It had turned into a cold numbness. I realized that all this time, I had been trying to win a race I could never win. I had spent years trying to be the perfect child so they would love me. But the fact was, their love wasn't something that could be bought with achievements or obedience. Their love was a privilege granted only to Ivy. That night, when the party ended and all the guests had gone home, I saw their family photo already uploaded to social media. The caption read, "Blessed Family." A perfect evening. In the photo, the three of them were smiling broadly. Hundreds of people liked the post, praising how harmonious they looked and how beautiful Ivy's new watch was. Not a single person asked where their eldest daughter was. I had been completely erased from the narrative of this family. I went up to my room, a small space furthest from the master suite. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my bare wrist. I didn't need a $15,000 watch. I just needed to be acknowledged that I existed. But in this house, I realized I would never get that. That night, in the darkness of my room, I made a decision. If I wasn't considered part of this family, then I would stop trying to be a part of them. I would start building my own world, where I wouldn't have to be anyone's shadow. The morning after the party felt incredibly silent, yet my head was deafeningly loud. While brewing coffee in the now tidy kitchen, I saw the remains of Ivy's gift box lying on the dining table. Seeing that object dragged my memory back to the past, to the years where this pattern of favoritism was formed and hardened like cement. My parents always had an excuse for every difference in treatment I received compared to Ivy. They called it independence training for me, while for Ivy, they simply called it love. Ever since we were children, the disparity was crystal clear. I remember when I was 10 years old and managed to win a national writing competition. I came home carrying a silver trophy and a literal overflowing sense of pride. I imagined Dad would lift me up and Mom would cook my favorite meal. However, when I arrived home, the atmosphere was chaotic because Ivy, who was 6 at the time, was crying hysterically. The reason was simple. She had dropped her ice cream on the floor. Mom was busy soothing Ivy by buying her a new toy that very afternoon, while my trophy was merely placed on a dusty bookshelf, never to be discussed again. When I tried to show my certificate of achievement, Dad only gave my shoulder a brief pat, saying I was a smart kid and could certainly celebrate my own success. From that day on, I began to understand one bitter truth. My achievements were a duty, while Ivy's failures were my responsibility to fix. Entering my teenage years, the chasm of difference widened further. When Ivy turned 16, my parents rented a hotel ballroom and bought her a brand new car. This was despite the fact that Ivy didn't even have a driver's license yet and her school grades were a mess. They reasoned that the car would motivate her to study harder. Meanwhile, when I reached that same age, I had to work part-time at a bookstore after school just to buy a second-hand laptop so I could complete my school assignments. Every time I tried to protest this injustice, Mom would pull out her signature line. She would say that I was a strong child with great character, so I didn't need help like the weak Ivy. They turned my independence into an excuse to ignore me. They used my success to justify their decision to give me nothing. Psychologically, they made me feel that asking for help was a failure of character. I remember when I applied for college. I studied late into the night for months to earn a full scholarship at one of the best universities. I succeeded. I felt I had lightened their financial burden by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet, the money that should have been my tuition budget was instead diverted to fund Ivy's lifestyle. She got a luxury apartment downtown, designer clothes, and overseas vacations every summer. Meanwhile, I lived in a tiny dorm and ate instant noodles so my pocket money would stretch far enough to buy reference books. Once, I fell ill from the exhaustion of working while studying. I called home just to hear Mom's voice, hoping she would tell me to come home so she could take care of me. However, the conversation lasted only 2 minutes. Mom talked at length about how stressed she was because Ivy had just broken up with her boyfriend and was locking herself in her room. Mom told me to stay strong because she didn't have the energy left to deal with another complaining child. I hung up the phone with tears I could no longer hold back. There, in that cold dorm room, I realized I wasn't just number 2, I wasn't even on their list of priorities. The most painful part was how they always involved me in Ivy's problems. If Ivy failed an exam, they called me and asked me to help her study. If Ivy crashed her car, they asked me to handle the insurance because I was considered legally savvy. I became an unpaid personal assistant for a sister who never even said thank you. They raised me to be a servant for the family's interests, but they never gave me a seat at the same dining table. Back in the kitchen this morning, I saw Dad coming downstairs with a fresh face. He saw me and immediately asked if I had washed the crystal glasses from last night's party. There was no thank you for my help yesterday. No question about whether I felt hurt being excluded from the family photo. To him, I was merely a tool that functioned well. Eleanor, Ivy needs help setting up the insurance for her new watch, Dad said while pouring coffee. You know how she is, she doesn't understand administrative things like that. Please take care of it today, okay? I stared at my father's back with a feeling that was hard to describe. There was an anger boiling beneath the surface, yet I still had the old habit of being obedient. For 24 years, I had been the child they molded to be a shield and a support for Ivy. They never saw me as a human being with feelings and desires. They only saw me as a reliable machine to clean up the messes they created themselves. I set my coffee cup down slowly. That $15,000 watch was the symbol of all the neglect I had received over the last 2 decades. It was physical proof that to them, Ivy's shallow happiness was far more important than my years of dedication and hard work. I began to realize that if I stayed in this house, I would die slowly from a lack of love. I had to stop being the person responsible for everyone else and start being responsible for my own happiness. My father's request to handle the insurance for Ivy's watch was the final drop that overflowed my cup of patience. That morning, as I stood in the vast cold kitchen, I didn't argue. I simply nodded slowly, an automatic habit ingrained over decades. However, inside my head, a massive plan began to take shape. I realized that as long as I remained under this roof, I would always be an unpaid assistant to my sister and a servant to my parents' social ambitions. I began to calculate my assets. Over the last 2 years working at a law firm as a junior assistant, I had been saving money in secret. I never flaunted it or bought luxury items. I intentionally led my parents to believe that my salary was only enough for daily living expenses, so they wouldn't ask for more money from me. As it turned out, my decision to live frugally was my saving grace. I had enough money in my reserve savings to pay the down payment on a small apartment and survive for several months. The first step I took that day wasn't calling the insurance company for Ivy's watch. Instead, I opened a property search website. I looked for a place far from this neighborhood, a place where my parents couldn't just drop by to tell me to wash dishes or fix their administrative messes. I found a studio apartment that was simple but clean near the business district, much closer to my office. I carried out the process of moving my belongings with extreme precision and secrecy. I didn't want a grand confrontation that would only allow them to play the victim. Every morning before leaving for work, I packed a few pieces of clothing and essential items into a large gym bag. My parents wouldn't suspect anything because they were used to seeing me head to the gym before the office. I didn't bring those bags back home. Instead, I left them in my office locker or moved them directly into the trunk of my old car. Throughout this process, I had to continue playing the role of obedient Eleanor. At the dining table, I still listened to my mother busily planning Ivy's next luxury vacation. I still listened to my father complaining about his work pressure as if he were the only person in the world working hard. I learned to turn a deaf ear. Every time they spoke, I simply gave a thin smile and short answers. I felt like a stranger observing someone else's life. One afternoon, Ivy burst into my room without knocking. She was wearing her new Cartier watch and looked incredibly frustrated because she didn't know how to sync the complicated time settings. She threw the manual onto my bed and demanded that I read it to her. In the past, I would have done it immediately, providing an easy-to-understand explanation. But this time, I just stared at the brochure without touching it. I told her I was busy with office documents and that she should learn to read it herself. Ivy looked absolutely stunned. She stared at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. She complained to Mom, and 5 minutes later, Mom was standing at my door with a displeased expression. She told me I shouldn't be selfish and that I had to help my sister because Ivy was unused to technical things. Normally, I would feel guilty and apologize immediately. However, that afternoon, I just looked at Mom flatly. I realized that she didn't see me as an older sister who was exhausted after working 10 hours. She only saw me as Ivy's broken-down helper tool. "I'll help her later when my work is done," I said calmly. It was a deliberate lie told to end the debate. In reality, inside the bag lying under my desk, there was already a signed lease for my new apartment. The night before I actually left, I walked around the house one last time. I looked at the photos on the walls. Almost every photo featured Ivy with her wide smile, while I was often just on the periphery or not there at all. I saw the grand living room, the modern kitchen, and the manicured garden. All of this was a house, but it had never been a home to me. There was no warmth here, only the demand to always be perfect without ever being appreciated. I wrote a short, very direct letter. I didn't include grievances or overflowing anger because I knew they would only dismiss it as dramatic behavior. I simply wrote that I had decided to live closer to work to focus more on my career. I thanked them for the roof they had provided all these years, but I also made it clear that from now on I would be managing my life entirely on my own. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, around 5 o'clock. While the entire house was still draped in silence, I carried my last suitcase out to the car. I felt no sadness as I closed the front door of that house for the final time. Instead, an incredible sense of lightness spread through my chest. For the first time in 24 years, I didn't have to think about what my parents wanted or what Ivy needed. I drove my car away from the driveway of that luxury home just as the sun began to rise. In the rearview mirror, I watched the house slowly shrink and disappear behind the trees. I knew that soon my phone would be flooded with angry messages or calls asking where I was and why I hadn't prepared breakfast. But as I reached the main highway, I disabled all notifications. The first week in my new apartment was the quietest yet strangest moment I had ever experienced. The place was small, perhaps only a quarter of the size of my parents' living room, but every inch of it was mine. No one called my name just to fetch a drink, and no one ordered me to clean up a mess I didn't make. However, that peace was disturbed when I accidentally opened social media and saw my mother's post, which had gone viral. The photo from the night of their wedding anniversary celebration had now spread far and wide. In the image, my father, mother, and Ivy looked incredibly happy under the light of the crystal chandelier. Ivy intentionally tilted her hand slightly so that the diamond-encrusted Cartier watch would catch the camera's light. The caption was very sweet, speaking about how blessed they felt to have such a complete and harmonious family. Thousands of people liked the post, and hundreds of comments praised how elegant they were. I read those comments one by one. Many of our family friends wrote about how lucky Ivy was to have such generous parents. However, one thing made my chest tighten. Not a single person noticed that the eldest daughter of the family was missing from the photo. My father's business colleagues, my mother's social circle, and even our distant relatives seemed to have forgotten my existence. I had truly become a ghost in my own family's history. This digital erasure of my existence felt far crueler than my father's request for me to step aside during the photo session. My decision to disappear from the house began to trigger reactions a few days later. My phone, which I had intentionally silenced for 48 hours, was full of notifications. The first message came from my mother. She didn't ask if I had eaten or where I was living. The content of her message was very brief and accusatory. She asked why I hadn't answered the phone from Ivy, who needed help handling her annual tax returns. To her, my departure wasn't about the loss of a child, but about the loss of a reliable personal assistant. My father sent a more formal but cold message. He said that my move without official permission was a form of immaturity. He called me selfish for leaving the house while Ivy was busy with her social event preparations. Father wrote that family must stay together, which in his secret language meant I had to remain there to support their comfort. They used the word family as a weapon to manipulate my guilt, without ever granting me the same rights Ivy received. At the office, news of my move began to reach several colleagues who knew my parents. They looked at me with pity or curiosity. Some people asked why I was living in a simple apartment while my parents lived in a palace. I simply replied that I wanted to be more independent. I didn't want to air the family's dirty laundry, not because I wanted to protect their reputation, but because I didn't want my self-respect to depend on the mercy of others. I chose to remain professional and focus on my increasing workload. One afternoon, just as I had finished an important meeting, Ivy called me multiple times until I finally picked up. Her voice sounded both pampered and demanding. She complained that her new watch needed servicing because of a tiny scratch on the strap, and she didn't want to go to the shop alone. She asked me to pick her up and accompany her downtown. When I refused in a calm voice, Ivy immediately exploded. She accused me of being jealous of the gift she had received. She said I moved out on purpose because I couldn't stand seeing her as the favored child. Hearing that, I wasn't angry. Instead, I felt sorry for her. Ivy never realized that the $15,000 watch wasn't just a gift, but a tool to keep her dependent and helpless. She didn't realize that the price she had to pay for all that luxury was her inability to stand on her own 2 feet. I told her that I wasn't jealous. I was simply finished with my role as her personal bodyguard. I cut the call before she could hurl any more insults. That night, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment, staring at the city lights. I realized that the digital world and public opinion were nothing more than a stage play. My parents would continue to flaunt their perfect lives on the internet to cover the emptiness inside their home. They would continue to upload beautiful photos that ignored my existence because I didn't fit the ideal family image they wanted to build. But to me, that was no longer a problem. I took my phone and did the one thing I should have done long ago. I unfollowed my parents' and Ivy's social media accounts. I no longer wanted to see that watch, that incomplete family photo, or the fake luxury built upon the neglect of my feelings. I cleared their notifications and felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. The climax of all this injustice happened exactly 2 weeks after I settled into my new apartment. During that time, I tried to build a quiet routine, leaving for work early and returning after dark to organize my simple living space. However, that peace was shattered when a large ivory white envelope was slipped under my apartment door. I immediately recognized my mother's handwriting on it. When I opened it, I didn't find a letter of apology or a sincere dinner invitation. Instead, I found stacks of invoices from the vendors of their wedding anniversary party. Inside the envelope were detailed costs for catering, floral decorations, and even the professional photographer's fee, the same photographer who had cast me out of the family photo frame. The total bill reached thousands of dollars. There was a small handwritten note from my father in the corner of the paper. He wrote that since I was now working and living independently, it was time for me to contribute to family expenses. He requested that I transfer half of the total party cost to his account by the end of this week at the latest. The reason he used was classic. As the eldest child, I had to show respect and responsibility for my parents' happiness. I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at the numbers on that paper with disbelief. They had just spent $15,000 on a luxury watch for Ivy, yet they were asking me to pay for a party that didn't even welcome my presence. Their logic was completely twisted. They felt capable of buying branded goods for their favorite child, but considered the party costs a collective burden to be borne by the child they ignored. This was no longer just favoritism. It was financial exploitation wrapped in a label of moral obligation. I didn't immediately explode in anger. Instead, I felt a cold silence in my head. I took my phone and called my mother. When she picked up, her voice sounded incredibly casual, as if sending a bill for thousands of dollars to her child was an everyday occurrence. She immediately asked if I had received the documents and when I could send the money, as they wanted to settle with the vendors quickly to maintain the family's reputation. "Mom, you just bought Ivy a Cartier watch worth $15,000, I said in a very flat, controlled voice. "Why didn't you use that money to pay for your own party? Why should I pay for an event that didn't even consider me part of the immediate family in the photos?" My mother's answer was devastatingly disappointing. She said that the gift for Ivy was a form of appreciation because Ivy brought so much joy to the house, whereas I was someone who was always serious and rigid. She added that the money used for the watch was a specific gift budget, while the party was an expense that should be shared. She even had the nerve to say that I should feel honored to help my parents after everything they had given me since I was a child. I realized right then that there was no point in arguing with someone who had blinded themselves to justice. To her, everything I gave was an obligation, while everything they gave me was an act of extraordinary generosity. I asked her what exactly they had given me lately besides a list of chores and neglect. Mom went silent for a moment, then began to sob on the phone, employing emotional manipulation tactics. She accused me of turning into a calculating and ungrateful child. Shortly after, Dad took over the phone. His voice was heavy and threatening. He said that if I didn't help pay these bills, I no longer needed to consider them my parents. He called me a disgrace to the family for letting my parents struggle to pay vendors while I worked at a prestigious law firm. He made no mention of the fact that I had to struggle alone to pay my own rent and living expenses without a single cent of help from them. He hung up after giving an ultimatum that I had 3 days to send the money. I put the phone down on the floor. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. For years, guilt was the rope they used to pull me back every time I tried to distance myself. But this time the rope snapped. Their absurd demand actually set me free. They had shown very clearly that to them, I was no longer a daughter, but an emergency fund they could squeeze at any time. That night, I made a very bold decision. I took photos of those bills and sent them back to the family group chat. I wrote that I would not pay a single penny for a party that explicitly excluded me from the family photo. I also wrote that if they had money to buy luxury for Ivy, then they had money to pay their own debts. I emphasized that my role as the responsible child ended tonight. After sending the message, I blocked each of their phone numbers. I also blocked Ivy because I knew she would immediately call to berate me for being stingy. I felt an incredible sense of power while doing so. I realized that all this time I was afraid of losing them, when in reality I never truly had them to begin with. All I had was the role they forced upon me. I stood up and straightened my apartment. The city lights shone through the window, casting a calm reflection in the room. I didn't have a luxury watch, and my bank account might not be as fantastic as my father's, but I had something far more valuable: integrity. I would not let anyone, even my own parents, treat me like a heartless ATM. The new chapter of my life truly began now, and it involved no bills or manipulation from anyone. After blocking their numbers, I felt a silence I had never experienced in my life. There were no more phone vibrations in the middle of the night asking me to clean up Ivy's messes. No more emails from father containing instructions to handle his private affairs. However, this silence also brought new challenges. I had to truly prove that I could stand on my own without the shadow of my family's big name. I decided to immerse myself completely in my work at the law firm. At the office, I became the first to arrive and the last to leave. I took on the small cases that other lawyers avoided and worked on them with extraordinary precision. My focus was no longer on winning my parents' hearts with my achievements, but on building the foundation of my own life. Every document I reviewed and every legal research I completed felt like an additional brick for my fortress of protection. I was no longer working for praise. I was working for absolute financial independence. While I began to organize my life, I heard news about the situation at home from an old family friend I accidentally met at a coffee shop. She told me with a concerned tone that the atmosphere at my parents' house was very tense. Without my presence to manage the household budget and oversee expenses, their finances were starting to spiral out of control. It turned out that all this time, I was the one quietly implementing efficiencies so they could live luxuriously without going into debt. Now, with Ivy's increasingly lavish lifestyle and mother's unstoppable shopping habits, the cracks in the walls of their palace were beginning to show. Ivy reportedly continued to use her $15,000 watch as a ticket to enter even more expensive high society circles. She began demanding overseas vacations every month to maintain her social media image. Because father didn't want to look like a failure in front of his friends, he continued to indulge Ivy's wishes using credit cards. They didn't realize that the engine that had kept everything stable was gone. I simply listened to the story with a thin smile. There was a sense of relief knowing that they finally had to face the consequences of their own choices. 3 months passed without any communication at all. I began to gain a good reputation at the office. My boss started to notice that my performance had improved significantly since I moved into my own apartment. He gave me the responsibility to assist in a major case involving a multinational corporation. This was a golden opportunity that could change my career forever. I spent my nights in the office library, surrounding myself with law books and complex data. For the first time, I felt proud of myself, not because I was helping someone else, but because I was helping my own dreams. However, that peace was disturbed when one afternoon, my office assistant said there was a young woman waiting for me in the lobby. It was Ivy. She looked different than usual. Although she was still wearing branded clothes and her Cartier watch sparkled on her wrist, her face looked very stressed. She tried to hug me as if nothing bad had happened between us. She began to tell me with a trembling voice that mom and dad were fighting frequently because of debt issues. She pleaded with me to come home and help them reorganize the family finances. Ivy said that as an older sister, I shouldn't be so heartless as to watch the family fall apart. She even blamed me, saying my departure was the cause of the stress mother was experiencing. I looked at my pathetic sister with a cold gaze. I asked her why she didn't sell her expensive watch to help father pay the bills. Ivy looked offended and said that the watch was her pride and she couldn't possibly let it go. It was then I realized that Ivy never truly loved me. She only missed the convenience I provided for her. I explained to Ivy in a very calm and professional voice, as if I were speaking to a difficult client. I told her that I was no longer part of the solution to their problems. I reminded her that they were the ones who claimed I was an immediate family during the party photo session. If I wasn't immediate family in terms of happiness and celebration, then I wasn't immediate family in terms of burdens and debts. I asked Ivy to leave my office and told her that her presence was starting to interfere with my professionalism at work. Ivy left crying and cursing at me, calling me a person with no heart. After she left, I went back to my desk and continued my work as if nothing had happened. My colleagues only stole a quick glance, but I didn't care what they thought. I had learned that being good and responsible to people who only take advantage of you is a form of self-insult. I chose to be bad yet have dignity rather than being good but constantly stepped on. That night, when I returned to my quiet apartment, I realized one important thing. Real growth often feels painful and lonely. I had to let go of the role of the devoted daughter to become a whole human being. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman much stronger than the one who stood in the corner of the party room months ago. I was no longer waiting for someone to give me expensive jewelry. I was forging my own courage, and that is a jewel that can never be seized by anyone, including my family. Entering the 6th month since I cut ties with my family, my life began to take on a new shape. My studio apartment no longer felt empty or foreign. It had transformed into the most comfortable sanctuary in the world. Here, I didn't have to wake up with a sense of anxiety about who would scold me today or what new problem I had to fix for Ivy. My focus was now entirely directed toward the one thing I had ignored for so long, myself. My career at the law firm flourished at a speed I never imagined possible, especially after I stopped draining my mental energy on toxic household drama. My boss, a senior partner named Marcus, began giving me much greater responsibilities. He saw my meticulousness in handling documents and my ability to remain calm under pressure. I was appointed as part of the core team to handle the merger of 2 major technology companies. It was a multi-million-dollar project that required extraordinary hard work. However, instead of feeling burdened, I felt alive. Every hour of overtime spent at the office felt fulfilling because I was doing it for my own future, not to cover up someone else's mistakes. In the midst of my busy career, I began to build a completely different circle of friends. Previously, my friends were only the children of my parents' business associates, people who only cared about status and which brands were currently trending. Now, I am friends with fellow young professionals from diverse backgrounds. We often gather after work at a small cafe near the office. There we discuss dreams, failures, and hobbies without anyone feeling superior. For the first time in my life, I felt heard not because of what I could give, but because of who I truly am. One of my close friends, Sarah, is a public accountant with very strong life principles. One night, while we were having dinner together, she commented on how calm I was when facing problems. I told her a little about my family background without giving too many dramatic details. Sarah just looked at me and said that the strength I possessed didn't come from ease, but from my ability to let go of burdens I was never meant to carry. That simple sentence provided the validation I had sought from my parents for years but never received. Meanwhile, news about my family still reached my ears occasionally through social media, which I viewed from a very private new account. I saw my parents still trying to maintain their image. However, something was different. The photos they uploaded looked forced. Ivy was seen wearing the same clothes across several events, something highly unusual for her, as she was always hungry for new collections. I also heard that father had begun selling some of his classic car collections under the guise of wanting a change of scenery, though everyone knew it was due to liquidity pressure. Seeing all that, I felt no vengeful satisfaction. I only felt freedom. I realized that for years, I was the pillar holding up the roof of their house so it wouldn't collapse. Once that pillar was removed, the structure began to wobble. However, that was not my fault. It was the result of their own greed and blindness. They chose to invest in a $15,000 watch rather than an emotional relationship with their eldest daughter. Now, they must learn how to live in the reality they created for themselves. At the office, my hard work finally yielded significant results. The merger project I handled was a great success without any meaningful legal obstacles. Marcus called me into his office and gave me high praise. He said I possessed a legal instinct rarely seen in someone my age. As a token of appreciation, the firm gave me a bonus of a fantastic amount, far exceeding my savings from the past 2 years. When I saw the numbers in my bank account, I didn't think of buying luxury goods. Instead, I felt financially secure, feeling far more luxurious than any piece of jewelry. With that bonus money, I decided to pamper myself in a dignified way. I didn't buy a Cartier watch like Ivy's. Instead, I enrolled in an international law certification course. I had long eyed and booked a solo vacation ticket to Iceland. I wanted to see the northern lights and experience solitude in the middle of vast nature. I wanted to celebrate my success in a way that enriched my soul, not just to satisfy the gaze of others on the internet. My social life also continued to improve. I began to learn how to say no without feeling guilty. I started to love my hobbies again, like reading fiction on weekends or cooking new recipes in my small kitchen. There were no more hidden competitions with my sister. No more efforts to seek my father's attention. I felt as if I had just woken up from a long sleep full of nightmares. I am now Eleanor, an independent woman who has value in her own eyes. My family's situation turned out to worsen much faster than I had anticipated. Entering the 8th month since I left, the cracks in their financial foundation were no longer just rumors. Through several old acquaintances, I heard that father had started taking out high-interest short-term loans to sustain the lavish lifestyle he refused to let go of. They were trapped in a vicious cycle, forced to maintain their image as a wealthy family before their social circle, while father's income as a senior consultant began to drop drastically. However, instead of practicing frugality, they chose to take desperate measures to drag me back into their mess. One Tuesday afternoon, I was surprised by the arrival of a large package at my office. It didn't contain legal documents, but rather boxes of my personal belongings that I had left behind at the house. On top of the pile of clothes sat a letter from Mother, written in a tone very different from before. She was no longer cursing or demanding. This time, she used a pleading tone. She wrote that she was gravely ill and missed the presence of her eldest daughter. She begged me to come home for a family dinner because there was something very urgent they wanted to discuss amicably. Even though my heart had grown quite hard, the word ill still triggered my human instincts. I decided to go, but not as a submissive child. Rather as a wary guest. I wore a sharp office suit and drove my car toward my childhood home. As I entered the vast front yard, I noticed that the garden, which used to be immaculately kept, was now starting to look neglected. Wild grass had begun to grow among the expensive flowers, a sign that they could no longer even afford to pay the gardener regularly. When I entered, Mother greeted me with a very convincing performance. She wore a dressing gown and sat on the sofa with a face made to look pale. However, I immediately realized her lie when I saw the food tray beside her filled with heavy dishes that someone truly gravely ill could not possibly eat. Father emerged from his study, his face looking much older and haggard. Ivy was also there, sitting quietly in the corner of the room without the Cartier watch on her wrist. It was a strange sight. Dinner proceeded with incredible awkwardness. Father opened the conversation by praising my success at the law firm. He said how proud he was to hear I was handling a major merger case. I just listened while continuing to eat my food, waiting for the core of this drama to surface. Finally, after some exhausting small talk, Father set down his spoon and looked at me seriously. He admitted that they were in serious financial trouble and the house was at risk of being foreclosed by the bank within 3 months if they couldn't pay off the arrears. Their plan was very cunning. They wanted me to be a guarantor for a new loan they were going to take out. Father said that with my reputation as a lawyer at a prestigious firm, the bank would easily approve the loan. They promised they would pay it in installments, and I only needed to provide my signature as a formality. They even tried to touch my emotional side by saying that if this house were lost, Ivy would have nowhere to live and the family's reputation would be completely destroyed. I looked at them one by one. Mother, who was faking illness. Father, who was trying to manipulate my career. And Ivy, who only cared about her own comfort. I asked Ivy where her $15,000 watch was. She answered in a low voice that she had already pawned it to pay off credit card installments last month, but the money still wasn't enough. I realized that they didn't truly miss me. They only needed my signature to save themselves from the consequences of their own stupidity. You're asking me to risk my career and my name to cover a lifestyle that didn't even involve me? I asked in a calm but firm voice. I explained to Father that as a lawyer, I knew exactly the risks of being a guarantor. If they failed to pay, I would be the one pursued by the bank, and my credibility at the law firm would be destroyed instantly. I told them I would never sign any document related to their debts. Father began to lose his patience. He slammed the table and shouted that I was an ungrateful child. He said that all the costs of my upbringing since childhood were an investment I now had to pay back. Mother started crying hysterically, accusing me of wanting to see them become homeless. However, I did not budge. I had learned that conditional love is not love. It is a transaction. And I refused to be a commodity in their transaction ever again. I stood up from the dining chair, straightened my bag, and looked at them for the last time during that meeting. I suggested they sell this large house, move to a smaller apartment, and start living according to their current means. I said that poverty is not a disgrace, but deceiving one's own child for financial gain is an ignominy. I walked out of that house while Father continued to curse behind me. As I sat in the car, I took a deep breath. It felt like I had just escaped a death trap. I realized they would never change. To them, I remained a tool only now. The tool was considered more valuable because of my position at the office. I immediately contacted the bank unofficially through my connections to ensure my name was not misused in any documents they might forge. Time moved on, and I never looked back after that night of rejection. 2 months later, years of my hard work finally reached its peak. The law firm where I worked announced its annual promotion list, and my name was at the very top for the position of senior associate. This was no ordinary promotion. At just 25 years old, reaching this position was an incredibly rare achievement. The office provided me with a new, larger workspace with a stunning view of the city, along with a benefits package that secured my financial future. However, just as I was celebrating this success, news of my family's downfall exploded publicly. Everything they had been hiding behind luxury photos on social media was finally exposed. My father failed to repay the short-term loans he had taken, and the bank began foreclosure proceedings on our luxury home. Because they were well-known figures in social circles, the news spread rapidly. The same people who used to praise the luxury of Ivy's watch in the comments section were now talking about their bankruptcy with mocking tones. I saw an article on a local news portal featuring a photo of my childhood home wrapped in police tape and a foreclosure notice. Seeing that image, I didn't feel deep sadness, but rather a certainty that every action has consequences. They tried to build a palace on the sands of debt and neglect, so it was only natural for it all to crumble when the storm hit. Ivy, who used to be so proud of her golden child image, had now disappeared from the social media radar. She could no longer flaunt luxury because there was simply nothing left to show off. One afternoon, while I was reviewing documents in my new office, my secretary came in and informed me that a man was insisting on seeing me without an appointment. It was my father. However, the man standing before me now was very different from the arrogant man who had pushed me out of the family photo a year ago. His suit looked slightly oversized, his face was haggard, and his eyes no longer radiated authority. He sat across from me with hands that trembled slightly. He began to tell me that they were now living in a cheap motel after their house was seized. My mother was suffering from severe depression, and Ivy refused to leave her room. Father asked me to use my legal connections to delay the foreclosure process or at least find them a decent place to live. He didn't even hesitate to ask for a portion of my promotion bonus so they could start a new life. He spoke as if my success belonged to the family and should be shared to cover their failures. I looked at him calmly. There was no anger in my voice as I answered. I told him that as a lawyer, I deeply respect contracts and the law. I could not manipulate bank procedures just because of a blood relation, especially for problems caused by their own negligence. I reminded him of the night he claimed I wasn't part of the immediate family. I explained that since then, I had complied with his wish for me to live as a stranger. You cannot discard me when you feel strong and then call me back when you are weak, I said in a professional tone. I offered to pay for Mother's treatment if she indeed needed medical help, but I firmly refused to provide cash or financial guarantees for their lifestyle. I offered a practical solution. I would find Ivy an entry-level job at one of my client's companies so she could start learning how to earn her own money. Hearing that offer, Father actually took offense. He felt that a job offer for Ivy was an insult. He was still clinging to a pride that had already been shattered. He stood up and accused me of being an unempathetic child, one who could heartlessly watch her family be destroyed while I lived in luxury. I only gave a thin smile and showed him out of my office. I realized that even at their lowest point, they still couldn't see their own mistakes. They still felt the world owed them something. After my father left, I stood by my office window, looking at the busy streets below. I felt relieved because I had the power to say no. In the past, I might have given in and drained my entire savings just to see them smile again. But now I know that helping them in that way would only prolong their own suffering. They need to feel the reality of life without my protection so they can learn to appreciate things. That night, my colleagues threw a small party to celebrate my promotion. There, I was surrounded by people who valued me for my competence, not for how much money I could lend. I laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the moment fully. I realized that true family are those who stand beside you when you are building from zero, not those who only show up when you've already reached the top. That night, the restaurant on the top floor of the city's tallest skyscraper was filled with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. I was celebrating my team's success in closing the biggest business deal of the year. My colleagues, Marcus, and a few close friends gathered around a long table decorated with absolute elegance. The city lights below looked like a carpet of diamonds. For the first time in my life, I felt I was in the right place, surrounded by people who saw me as a whole human being, not just a convenient helper. In the middle of the warm conversation, my phone lying on the table vibrated. I glanced at the screen, and my heart beat a little faster when I saw a name that hadn't appeared in my notifications for a long time. Mom. I had unblocked them a few weeks ago, not because I wanted to return, but because I felt strong enough to no longer be affected by anything they had to say. I opened the message with a steady hand. Eleanor, we miss you so much. Can you come to our new place? We want to celebrate your success together. We realize we made a big mistake. Come back, sweetheart. I stared at the screen for a few moments. The phrase, we miss you, felt incredibly foreign. In the 24 years I lived under the same roof as them, those words were never spoken. They missed my presence only when their house was seized, when Ivy could no longer act pampered, and when they needed someone to fix their shattered reputation. Missing someone and missing someone's usefulness are two very different things, and I knew exactly which category they were referring to. Marcus noticed the change in my expression and asked if everything was all right. I gave a small smile, placed my phone back face down, and assured him it was just a minor, insignificant distraction. I went back to enjoying my dessert, letting the message hang without a reply. In the past, a message like that would have made me feel guilty and sent me running home to help them. But now, I realize that guilt is the final weapon for people who have lost control over you. My phone vibrated again. This time a photo was sent. It was an old photo from our family album, a picture of me when I was about 7 years old, holding Mom's hand. Beneath the photo was an additional message from Dad. Family is everything, Eleanor. Don't let success make you forget your own flesh and blood. This attempt at manipulation felt incredibly crude and outdated. They were using childhood memories to snare me back into their exhausting drama. I knew their situation now was very difficult. They were living in a cramped rental unit on the outskirts of the city. Ivy was reportedly having to start working at a retail store to help meet daily needs, something she absolutely detested. They wanted me to come bring my wallet, bring my influence, and restore the pride they had lost. An hour later, the party ended. I walked out onto the restaurant balcony to breathe in the fresh night air. I took my phone back out and looked at the clock on the screen. I remembered the night of their wedding anniversary party, when I was asked to step aside from the immediate family photo so as not to ruin the beauty of their image. At that time, it felt like the end of the world. But tonight, at the height of the 50th floor, I felt immensely grateful for that exclusion. If they hadn't cast me out that night, I might never have had the courage to find my own path. I looked at my wrist. There was no Cartier watch worth $15,000 there. I wore a simple leather watch I bought with my first salary as a senior associate. This watch was not encrusted with diamonds, but every second of it belonged to me. Every second reminded me of hard work, sleepless nights at the office, and the peace I built with my own sweat. This watch was more valuable to me than the most expensive jewelry in the world because it was not bought out of shame or favoritism. I began typing a reply. I didn't want to curse. I didn't want to vent anger, and I didn't want to argue. I just wanted to provide a final period to a story that had dragged on for far too long. I typed, I am glad you have begun to realize the meaning of family. I forgive you for everything in the past, but forgiving does not mean returning to the old patterns. I have my own life now, and I hope you also focus on building your new lives honestly. Do not contact me for financial matters or family drama again. I wish you well. After sending that message, I felt as if an iron chain that had bound my feet for decades finally snapped completely. I didn't wait for their reply. I immediately deactivated my phone and put it in my bag. I walked toward the elevator with a steady stride. 1 year has passed since that night at the restaurant, and my life now feels like a fresh blank slate. I stand in front of the large window of my new office, now holding the position of a junior director. The morning sunlight streams in, illuminating my neatly organized desk. There are no piles of someone else's bills, no insurance documents for luxury items that aren't mine, and no mental burdens weighing down my chest. I have learned that peace does not mean the absence of problems, but rather the ability to not let other people's problems become your personal responsibility. In the last few months, I have occasionally heard news about father, mother, and Ivy through distant relatives. They are now living in a reality very different from their glory days. Father works as an administrative staff member at a small firm, a position he often looked down upon in the past. Mother has begun learning to cook for herself and manage a household without servants. The most surprising is Ivy. She has finally settled into a job as a sales staff member. Reportedly, she no longer wears expensive jewelry, but she has started to learn the value of every cent she earns herself. Hearing this, I feel at peace. I do not feel victorious over their failure. Instead, I feel relieved that they were finally forced to grow up. All this time, I was the one hindering their growth by always fixing everything. With my departure, they had no choice but to face life. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do for others is to let them bear the consequences of their own actions. Last week, I received a physical letter from Ivy. Unlike the demanding social media messages, this letter was handwritten and sincere in tone. She didn't ask for money. She simply shared how difficult it is to work on her feet for 8 hours a day and how she finally realized how hard I worked in the past to support the family. She apologized for ever treating me like a stranger. I replied to her letter briefly, wishing her strength in her new job, while still maintaining a healthy professional distance. I have forgiven her, but I am not ready to return to the old dynamics. My personal life has also flourished in a very positive way. I have started a relationship with someone who deeply respects my privacy and independence. We often spend weekends doing simple activities like hiking or just reading books in the park. He doesn't know my bank balance, and he doesn't care about my family status. To him, I am just Eleanor, the intelligent and warm woman, not the Eleanor who must always be relied upon for others' affairs. It is a very liberating relationship where I don't have to be anyone's hero. At the office, I have just completed a mentorship program for young lawyers from underprivileged backgrounds. I want to use my current position to ensure that talented and hardworking people get a fair chance without having to feel invisible as I once did. Every time I see one of them win their first case, I feel a satisfaction far greater than receiving a financial bonus. I realize that true success is when we can pave the way for others to shine. I am reminded of a quote I once read: "Some families give you luxury, while others give you strength." I have received both in different ways. My parents provided a fleeting luxury, but their neglect gave me an eternal strength. If I had never been treated as if I didn't exist, I might never have had such a powerful drive to create my own existence. The pain on the night of that wedding anniversary party was the price I had to pay for my freedom today. Now, every time I look at the simple watch on my wrist, I smile. This watch does not display social status. Instead, it shows the time I have spent loving myself. I have stopped measuring my value based on other standards or how much of a burden I can carry for the family. I learned that loving oneself is not an act of selfishness, but the primary requirement for living with dignity.